What do we know about this war in Ukraine so far and the use of things like poisons and chemical warfare?
Sure. So we have seen around 10 different lines of discussion in relation to chemical and biological weapons and warfare in this conflict. The vast majority of them are spurious. So the most significant claim we saw the other week was Russia claiming, well, it made several claims, but one of the claims was that the Ukrainians were weaponizing birds. And this is basically almost a party piece at this point. Russia doesn't like the US's sphere of influence in certain labs in Ukraine, and so basically it made up some stories. It did the same thing in Georgia about a decade ago, and nothing came of that either. And then, in addition to that, we have perhaps some much more sincere concerns about the potential that chemical weapons may become involved in this conflict. And so we've seen discussion, for example, of whether or not Russia has chemical weapons, whether it would use them. We've seen discussion of what, in my view, is perhaps a more serious concern or more likely concern, the idea that industrial facilities which contain chemicals, which might be poisonous, might be targeted or damaged as part of this, or else utilised as some sort of false flag attack. And in addition to that, we've seen lots of other discussion, which a lot of it sits in this kind of broader geostrategic disinformation environment. So I'm not entirely sure how much stock I put in many of the claims.
Right. Well, that's what the U.S. has called the absurd propaganda, that Ukraine has biological weapons, that it has labs there. Again, all of this attributed to disinformation by Russia. Brett, part of the concern has been that that will be used as a pretext to use bioweapons. Do you think there's any credence to that argument?
Not. My gut says no. I think Russia, its disinformation and propaganda strategies are kind of well established now. They're in the groove. So they have common disinformation stories they use, and they also have this kind of scattergun approach to disinformation. So my reading of it is that most of the disinformation we've seen, particularly in relation to the kind of extension of much more long-standing general disinformation strategies, I don't see it as having any relationship to a kind of false flag or them preparing to use such weapons.
Brett, if I could just interject, what lessons can we learn from Syria and that playbook and how it may play out in this conflict?
Sure. I mean, that was a very different context, primarily because we knew that Syria had chemical weapons and we knew that they were employing them. In this context, there's no evidence that chemical weapons, as in kind of state-developed chemical weapons, neither of those states, we think, would possess them. We don't think Russia would possess at any scale. Obviously, Russia was recently implicated in the assassination attempt of Alexei, but also the Skripals in the UK near me. And so we think they may have some sort of small production capability, but nothing like the kind of large-scale or battlefield use which comes to mind, for example, you're thinking about Ghouta back in 2013.